Hello, everyone. Good to be with you today as we jump back into our Bible study series, making our way through the Bible together. Today we're in week number 9, almost done with book 1. And last week we talked about covenants, the covenant formula that is seen at Mount Sinai. We'll be building upon that as we go forward, but for our starting off today, I have a video that covers the subject of covenants. So if you're ready, let's make sure we're doing what we wanted to be doing. And here we go.
If you've been around Christians, you've probably heard of the idea of having a personal relationship with God, which could mean different things in the Bible, like having God as a friend, or your father, or maybe your teacher.
But there's one particular way that the Bible talks about this relationship that you find all over. But strangely, we don't talk about it that much, and that's the idea of a partnership with God.
A partnership like working alongside someone to accomplish a goal together.
Right, and this is actually what you see at the beginning of the Bible. God creates this good world full of all of this potential. And then God appoints these unique creatures, humans, as his partners in bringing more and more goodness out of all that potential.
But the humans don't want to partner with God. They rebel and try to create a world on their own terms.
And so this broken partnership is the Bible's explanation for why we're stuck in a world of corruption and injustice and the tragedy of death.
It's not like there's just one or two humans who have bailed on this relationship. In the story of the Bible, everyone has abandoned the partnership with God.
So what God does is select a smaller group of people out of the many, and he makes a new partnership with them called a covenant. And in a covenant, God makes promises, and then in exchange asks his partner to fulfill certain commitments. And the purpose of all of this is to somehow use this covenant relationship to renew his partnership with everybody else.
Now, there are actually 4 times in the Old Testament that we're told God initiates a covenant relationship with Noah, Abraham, the nation of Israel, and King David.
And it's through these that God is forming a covenant family into which all people will eventually be invited.
So let's see how these work. The first one is with Noah.
So in this story, God has just brought the flood to cleanse the world of humanity's corruption, and Noah and his family are the only ones left. And so God makes a covenant with Noah, saying, listen, I know that humans will continue to be evil, but despite that, I'm not going to destroy it like this again. Instead, the earth will be this reliable place for us to work together.
Great. So what does Noah have to do?
Nothing. And that's what's so interesting about this first covenant, is that God is promising to be faithful, even though he knows humans won't be.
The next time we see God make a covenant is with a man named Abraham. God chooses him, promises to bless him, give him a large family, lots of land where they can flourish.
And in return, God asks Abraham to trust him and train up his family to do what is right and just. And the whole reason for this covenant is God says that somehow he's going to bring his blessing to all families of the world through this one family.
So that's Abraham. The next time we see God make a covenant is when Abraham's family grows into the tribe of Israel.
And this covenant is with the whole tribe. God asks them to obey a set of laws, which are these guidelines for living well as a community of God's partners. And if they do this, then God promises to bless them and that they will become a people who then represent him to the rest of humanity.
That's the covenant with Israel. The last covenant is with King David.
Yeah, the tribe of Israel has become this large nation ruled by David. And God asked David and his descendants to partner with him by leading Israel in obeying the laws and doing what is right and just. And God promises that one day, one of David's sons will come and extend God's kingdom of peace and blessing over all the nations.
So those are the 4 covenants that God makes in order to restore his partnership with the whole world.
But here's what happens. Israel breaks the covenant. They worship other gods, they allow horrible injustice, and so they lose their land and are forced off into exile.
So it seems hopeless. But during this time, Israel's prophets talked about a day when God would restore these covenants in spite of Israel's failure, somehow.
Yeah, they called it the New Covenant. And this is actually what's so interesting about Jesus, is that he's introduced into this story as the one who fulfills all of these covenant relationships. We're told that he's from the family of Abraham, and so he will bring the blessings of that family to the whole world. We're told that he's the faithful Israelite who was able to truly obey the law. And we're told that he's the king from the line of David, and so he goes about extending God's kingdom of justice and peace to all.
And that's really...
Just real quick, I just wanted to lift that up a little bit more, because the Gospels really do, when Matthew's genealogy traces Jesus back to Abraham, that's this first, the second covenant rather, the covenant with Noah, that's not included here. But the covenant with Abraham, Jesus fulfills that one because his genealogy goes back to Abraham. He calls himself the Son of Man more times than any other way that he refers to himself. And the Son of Man is a term that Israel has used, that has been used for Israel. So he is fulfilling Israel's part in the covenant. And of course, one of the titles for Jesus is also Son of David. And that's this top one. So all of these covenants are parts that Jesus is fulfilling, is keeping on our behalf.
remarkable for one guy.
Yeah, and what it highlights is perhaps the most surprising claim of all made about this man, that Jesus is no mere human, but rather God become human. And God did this in order to be that faithful covenant partner that we are all made to be, but have failed to be. And so through Jesus, God has opened up a way for anyone to be in a renewed partnership with him.
So Jesus calls people to follow him and become part of this new covenant family.
And despite their failures, Jesus is committed to making them into partners who are becoming more and more faithful.
The story of the Bible ends with a vision of a fully renewed world, full of goodness and peace.
And there's this renewed humanity there, partnering together with God to expand the goodness of his creation. And so the end of the Bible story is really a new beginning. Hey.
Okay, so just briefly, the word covenant. How often do we really use that word? How often was it something that was lifted up or talked about in your experience?
Covenant almost sounds like a formal commitment.
Correct. It's a contract in many ways. The covenant sealing ceremony that we find in Genesis 15 is a really interesting one. And in that one, God is the one who participates in the covenant agreement ceremony. He calls Abraham to prepare animals, cut them in half, and put them in rows, mirroring each other. And then Abraham falls into a deep sleep, and God's presence is manifested in a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch. And those two items, they pass between the rows of animals that have been cut in half, as a way of saying, if I break my promise, my covenant, if I fail to keep up my end of this bargain, may my fate be like these animals. May my fate be the same fate as these animals if I break my covenant promise. So it really was a contract agreement. And at Mount Sinai, the people participated in that covenant agreement ceremony as well. Probably not the same one, but when God calls to the people through Moses, are you ready to enter into this relationship, to keep all these laws and these statutes and commandments? So the people say, yes. And so they're in. They basically signed on the dotted line. Now, they did not do so well at keeping up their end of the covenant agreement, as this video showed in those times when they were broken down. But then Jesus And here's another pop quiz. When we have communion on Sunday mornings or any time, the words of institution that the pastor says as the elements for communion are lifted up, the bread and then the wine. The words for the wine, and again after supper, Jesus took the cup, gave thanks, and gave it for all to drink, saying,
This is my blood shed for you.
close. This cup is the new what?
Covenant, yeah.
That's it. This cup is the new covenant, shed for you and for all people for the forgiveness of sins. But covenant, it's right there in the words of institution that we hear or say every Sunday for communion. Jesus was recognizing this very thing, that there's a new agreement, there's a new contract, a new arrangement that is being instituted. And Jesus is the one who is agreeing to it with God on our behalf.
That's going to have more meaning for me now.
Yeah,
When you say
right.
that.
It's right there.
Where
But
is it in the Bible?
what? 1 Corinthians. Where is it in the Bible?
Yeah, that's where.
I think in the NIV anyway, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 25. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. So yeah, covenant. And I liked what they did at the beginning of this video with all the different ways that we understand our relationship with God as a friend, as a father, but not as much as a partner. And the more I study with these guys, the Bible Project guys, the more on board I am with this being a very important way to understand our relationship with God. We are in a covenant partnership with God. Any other questions or thoughts on this review video? Okay, let's close this down. And let's go to here. Question.
Briefly, I read Matthew, the genealogy
Yes.
of Jesus, and it said 14 generations from Abraham to
David? I think it's Abraham to David.
and then there's 14 generations from David to somebody.
Right.
And then there's 14 generations. So there's 3 sets of 14 generations.
Yeah.
Are those mystical numbers of any kind? The 14, 14, 14, which makes 50?
Yes.
Or 40?
If you take a look, if you actually dig into the actual chronology, there's some finagling of those numbers. There's some massaging of those numbers to make them turn out to be, 7 times 2, 14. 7 times 2, 14. But 7 times 2. What the author of Luke was going for is these 3 groups of 7s. And yes, the number 7 is a very significant number in the Bible. A lot of a sense of completeness, a sense of rest, that we've arrived, that it's finished. Yeah. And the reason I say that, if you look at Luke's genealogy, the names don't match up perfectly, but that's okay. They don't have to. They did their best. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions before we jump into today? Okay. Like I said, we're on Unit 9. Last week was about covenants. And just to review, excuse me. Okay. The Israelites spent about 1 year at the foot of Mount Sinai. In Exodus chapter 19, it says they arrived. In Numbers chapter 10, it says they left. The 60 chapters between these two passages focus on what took place during their time at the foot of Mount Sinai. And these chapters contain a number of different groups of law codes. There's several more law codes given in the latter chapters of Numbers and in the book of Deuteronomy. But these different sources have been pulled together and crafted together and presented in a way to send a message. And I think next week we'll watch the video on Leviticus, because I like what that video does to kind of lay out the purpose of these law codes. But for this illustration today, here they are at Mount Sinai, the community of people. They find God there at Mount Sinai, and they see the thunder, the lightning. They see the lightning, feel the thunder, hear the thunder. They see the cloud and the fire and the presence of God covering the top of the mountain. This symbol, this yellow tablet, is the symbol for covenant. And last week we talked about the 6 different elements that go into making up the covenant. Line 1 is an introduction. I am the Lord your God. Line 2 is what God has just done for the people who led you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Line 3 is this part, what we will talk about today. Line 3 is the law codes, what God is asking of the people in response to number 2. Because God just freed them from slavery in Egypt, if they sign on the dotted line, here is what God is asking them to do in response. 4 is teach this to your children. 5 is the witnesses to this agreement. And 6 are the covenant blessings and curses if they keep these covenant law codes or if they fail to keep the covenant law codes. The tabernacle was built while they were at the foot of Mount Sinai as a place for God's presence to not just be up on top, but down in the midst of the people as well. And this is what made them a community at Mount Sinai. So, any thoughts, questions on that?
It looks like smoke coming up. Is that the burning of the incense or the burning of like
Yep.
Animals or something
That is the altar right there in the tabernacle.
Okay.
So that's where the sacrifices would have been offered up.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Good eyes. Any other questions? All right, next page. Excuse me. After God gathered the Israelites around his presence at Mount Sinai, God said to them, "Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation." God then made a covenant with them. In referring to them as a priestly kingdom, God did not mean that they were to do nothing but perform rituals in the tabernacle and the temple. Rather, they were to live under God as their king and to serve him as priests in all that they did. Now, what does that mean? What is meant by the term priest? In our context, priest is reserved for the Catholic Church and maybe the Eastern Orthodox Church. But a priest, by definition, is simply there in 3a and b, someone who handles the holy things, the sacred things, and who is an intermediary, someone who goes to God for others and goes to others for God. And in God's statement, what are the sacred things? God says, the whole earth is mine. I like that. Everything we touch has a sacred quality, for God made and owns all things. So all people are called to serve God as priests full time, in that they are called to glorify God and serve others in all that they do. Christianity, the Apostle Paul focuses on this call. And so here is a way of trying to capture what that idea is all about. So we have the earth belongs to God. God has stamped it with his label. And then around the outside, we have 8 pulpits with a priest behind the pulpit. And there are 8 different labels for these pulpits. And so here's another moment I want to pause and say, is your pulpit up there? Or would we have to add one along with a name for it? What is your pulpit?
Mine used to be farmer.
Perfect.
Servant.
Okay. Servant, farmer. Used to be, Doris. What would yours be today?
Probably servant.
Okay. Can you be more specific? Can any of us be more specific?
Well, even helping, I'm thinking even going down to the museum and helping people do
Perfect.
things and learn about their history and their background and everything.
Volunteer.
Mhm.
Volunteer would be up there. What else?
Serving your family.
A family member, mother, wife. You
And it can overlap, like she said, farmer.
Oh, yeah.
And merchant and.
Right. This is good. A lot of times we have trouble with this because we think it's supposed to be, doctor or priest or king. I ask my confirmation kids this question when we get to this point. What is their pulpit called? For them, what is it? For my confirmation age kids, what do they spend 7 hours a day doing?
Learning.
In school.
Student.
Mhm.
And I like that opportunity because their eyes kind of open up a little bit and say, oh, you don't think about what you're already doing as being an opportunity to serve God and serve others. So here's where those arrows get added in. Questions, thoughts. So the people of Israel were called to be a kingdom of priests. And this is what they did. They pointed people to God, and they pointed God to others. And that's as simple as it needs to be. Okay. Last illustration for today. At the top of page 120, we have a picture of the 2 different covenants that are in the Bible. We have the old one and the new one. So tell me about the old covenant. We talked our way through it 2 weeks ago. This illustration up here. What is the because? What has God done for the people?
He has remained steadfast.
According to the events in this illustration, it's something specific.
Okay.
You're not wrong, but we're looking for.
To the promised land.
Yep.
Got them out of Egypt, led them.
Freed them from slavery in Egypt, led them down to Mount Sinai and to the promised land. That's what God did for the people. And because of that, God is calling the people to do this. Therefore, because God did that, therefore God is calling them to be a community of people who do this, who have this posture, this attitude, this way of presenting themselves. They live their lives as servants to one another, loving one another in the same manner that Jesus loves us. Now that's getting ahead of ourselves. So now, here is the new covenant. Here's what God has done for us. And this is new stuff. So we have Jesus here on the left-hand corner, who lived a life of a servant without limit. We have the crown on his head. He's in a pose of servanthood. He goes to the cross for us. So his life, his death, and his resurrection, his freeing from the tomb, defeating sin, death, and the devil. So because of this, God calls us to be in a posture like Jesus. This is the posture that Jesus had his whole life. We are called to do likewise. Questions on that? Okay, this is a big deal. This is a big idea in the story of the Bible. So, just want to make sure. And it's probably not the first time we've heard this part before. This part is pretty well done by the church in general. So, because of this, God calls us to respond in this way. Okay. Pages 122, 123, 124, and 125 have a lot of in-depth details, all the different categories that the laws fall into as far as national and community life, national worship life, types of laws, the principles of them. But I am not going to read through all of these for you because I don't know if you can hear it, but my nose is really
Yeah, you're getting stuffed up.
yeah, it's starting to catch me. So
Yeah.
I am not going to make you suffer through all that. But I am going to say one more thing that I find interesting. And the question I want to ask is, with my household and my kids, there are rules that they have to follow. You might call them commandments. You might call them the terms of engagement that they have to follow. Do you think, and would you be excited about those kinds of things? Would you like having rules to follow? And just thinking of when you were growing up, when my kids are growing up. The answer is no. You would not be a fan. Yeah, you find the boundaries and you poke on it, because that's your full-time job. And so for a long time, I was kind of fascinated with how the Bible talks about these law codes. The people of Israel love them. They value them. They consider this to be a gift from God to the people. What is that about? Here's something new that I've learned recently. Any guesses?
Well, they know where they stand and they know what he expects of them.
Right.
That's it. That's exactly it. And it's very different from any other religion of the world of that day. The gods of that day didn't have these. And so the people who worshiped those gods, who gave sacrifices to those gods, never knew when they were or weren't in the good graces. And so here is God giving them a layout, a clear understanding of what God is asking. And I'd never thought about that before. But it'd be very much like, this wasn't my experience, and I hope this isn't the experience for anybody here, but if you had an alcoholic father who, when he would come home from the day, if he'd been at the bar, you wouldn't quite know. what you were going to get. And that relationship would be very tense. God is saying, here's how I operate, and here's how I'm asking you to operate. And I love that. So, questions on any of this for today? It's a little bit of the details that are behind the scenes. There's not a lot of narrative story that happens in this unit, but it's good to cover together. It's good to know. There's some big ideas in this unit. But I think if there's no other questions, I think I will call that good for today. Let me find my live stream. There you are. We'll stop the